The narrative of the Russian war effort has shifted from a conventional military operation to a systematic exercise in self-cannibalization. The hard truth is that Russia has functionally destroyed its army of 2022, and the replacements now being fed into the conflict are little more than expendable human filler protecting a rapidly dwindling supply of old equipment. The strategy is clear. The army is sacrificing its men to hoard its metal. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare, global affairs, and US domestic politics. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. Also, please watch this video to the very end, even if you play it in the background without sound, as your continuous viewing is critical to help promote the truth about the war. The evidence for this catastrophic change is rooted in the stark, inversely proportional trends of battlefield losses. While one might expect equipment losses to remain consistent in a war of attrition, the statistics show a deliberate strategic adjustment by the Russian command. Losses of armored vehicles and tanks have plummeted to record lows in recent months. This sharp reduction is not due to a sudden technological breakthrough or the efficacy of crude cope cages. It is because the army has intentionally reduced the application of armor by a factor of 4, reserving its precious few remaining serviceable vehicles. The old mechanized army is being saved for a future decisive gambit. However, the human cost of this strategic decision is devastating. The reduction in equipment usage is directly correlated with a surge in record-high personnel losses. The High Command is now relying almost exclusively on disposable infantry tactics, the human wave assaults and small group infiltrations that offer negligible protection. These are often poorly trained recruits and veterans held illegally past their contracts, who are being sent to neutralize minefields and draw fire without the armored support that is essential for survivability. The entire tactical doctrine has been inverted. Instead of using steel to protect flesh, the military is using flesh to preserve steel. This collapse of traditional military logic proves that the Russian High Command has accepted a grim and brutal trade-off. The systemic failure to generate fresh professional manpower means that the current army is functionally broken. The troops are being consumed in a relentless, self-exhausting process of attrition, all to accumulate a few hundred tanks and fighting vehicles in the rear. This hoarded reserve is intended for a final, high-risk operation, such as a major offensive or a confrontation with NATO, but the strategy is fundamentally flawed. It guarantees the internal collapse of troop morale and the hemorrhaging of human capital, confirming that the war is being prosecuted with profound strategic incompetence.
We have established the grim reality of the Russian front, the deliberate sacrifice of infantry to preserve equipment. This raises a critical and paradoxical question. If the Russian military is so desperately short of armor, why is it hoarding vehicles that could stabilize the front? The answer confirms a chilling strategic reality. Russia is actively and consciously building a concentrated armored reserve for a future, highly aggressive and high-risk operation that it cannot currently execute. The military-industrial complex is engaged in a remarkable, if unsustainable, internal maneuver. While the tempo of equipment loss on the front has fallen to its lowest point since the war began, the rate of production and restoration of armored vehicles has remained constant. Quantitative analysis shows a clear annual surplus of up to 1,000 tanks and an equivalent number of armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. This surplus is generated by the MIC's continuous effort to restore tens of thousands of aging Soviet-era machines from storage, even relics like the T-62, and by the steady, if slow, production of new tanks and APCs. This material gain is not accidental. It is a deliberate strategic directive from the Kremlin to build an operational fist. Putin has recognized that without overwhelming mechanical superiority, his current war efforts dissolve into costly, positional stalemates. Therefore, instead of feeding these newly restored vehicles immediately into the Ukrainian meat grinder, where they would be instantly destroyed by FPV drones and counter-artillery, they are being withheld. This critical mass of steel is intended for two possible catastrophic scenarios. First, the breakout offensive in Ukraine. The reserve is a necessary resource for a final, massive push to achieve the original war aims, the complete seizure of the Donbass, and a potential thrust to capture cities like Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. The High Command is betting that a concentrated assault of overwhelming size, even if technologically vulnerable, can temporarily breach the Ukrainian defense and achieve a strategic objective that has eluded them for years. Second, the geopolitical gamble. The reserve represents the military capability required to launch a surprise, high-risk attack against a NATO frontier, such as the Baltic states. Putin knows that an attack on Europe would require a massive, undeniable show of force to achieve a swift fait accompli. This hoarded inventory is the physical manifestation of that threat, designed to be deployed before NATO's own massive modernization programs come online, and before the industrial resources are ready to counter the threat. The paradox, however, is a profound moral and strategic failure. The hoarding of steel is directly linked to the unprecedented high personnel losses. The Russian army is sacrificing the lives of its infantry, the poorly trained recruits and veterans fighting without rotation, as a cost-saving measure to preserve this mechanical reserve. The soldiers are dying to buy time for the tanks, a strategy that is morally indefensible and structurally weak, guaranteeing the internal decay of the army's morale for the sake of a political resource.
We have analyzed the strategic directive to hoard reserves. Now we confront the quality of the equipment that is actually being sent into battle, a brutal reality that confirms the Russian military-industrial complex is fundamentally incapable of equipping its army for modern warfare. The vast majority of the armor on the front line is not a modern fighting force. It is a collection of relics and improvised vehicles, coffins equipped with cope cages, that are fundamentally obsolete against the lethality of the FPV drone. The core problem is one of technological stagnation and forced desperation. The armored vehicles being restored and deployed are largely composed of heavily outdated models, primarily the T-62 and older variants of the T-72, alongside antiquated infantry fighting vehicles like the BMP-3. These are machines designed for a 20th century battlefield, incapable of withstanding modern tandem charge anti-tank weapons or the specific top attack threats posed by cheap, ubiquitous drones. While the MIC produces a trickle of newer T-90M models, the mass of the armored fleet remains vulnerable, poorly protected, and structurally unsound. This quality failure has necessitated the rise of improvised, desperate defenses. The entire army has resorted to installing crude, homemade modifications known as mangles or cope cages, grills of metal welded over the turret and engine deck. While these structures might occasionally detonate a basic, non-tandem munition, they are now functionally useless against the adaptive tactics of Ukrainian drone operators. The technological agility of the Ukrainian forces has already countered this basic defense. Instead of attacking the heavily protected turret or the front glasses plate, drone pilots are now specifically instructed to aim for the weakest points of the vehicle: the engine deck, which is structurally vulnerable to fire and explosions, and the tracks and running gear, which instantly immobilize the tank. A stationary, burning tank quickly becomes a guaranteed loss. This structural vulnerability makes the mechanized assaults, the tactic Akhmedov's troops are fond of, suicidal. When these old, inadequately protected vehicles are committed to a fight dominated by FPV drones, they do not function as fire support, they operate as targets. The continuous logistical effort and manpower drain required to pull these damaged, burning relics off the battlefield is immense. Furthermore, the improvised armor itself often compounds the mechanical failure. placing stress on the vintage transmission and drive components, causing the machines to break down even before they encounter the enemy. The ultimate indictment is that this systemic failure is not accidental. It is the result of a corrupt and rigid military procurement system. The MIC prioritizes the refurbishment of obsolete equipment and cosmetic upgrades that maximize profits over the structural modernization necessary to protect the soldier. The result is a force that is incapable of achieving the necessary armored breakthroughs and is compelled to sacrifice its remaining mechanical reserves on a battlefield where the only reliable weapon is a cheap, unmanned system. The troops are sent forward not in battle-ready fighting vehicles, but in steel coffins.
We have analyzed the systemic failure of armored quality. Now we must confront the central tactical catastrophe that is consuming Russia's remaining reserves: the persistent, brutal adherence to mechanized assaults led by incompetent commanders, which has turned the autumn campaign into a disastrous exercise in human sacrifice. The current tactical dilemma is driven by an environmental necessity. The onset of the Rasputitsa, the deep, paralyzing mud of the Donbass, has eliminated the feasibility of the light infantry and motorcycle infiltration tactics used throughout the summer. The only vehicles that possess the necessary mobility to cross the sodden landscape are tanks and heavy armored personnel carriers. The High Command, compelled by political pressure to demonstrate progress before winter, is forced to commit its armored reserves. This necessity has created a disastrous battlefield scenario where the need for mobility collides with the certainty of destruction. This enforced tactical pivot has exposed the chronic incompetence of the Russian command structure. The mechanized assaults being launched near Pokrovsk are not simply failing, they are being designed for failure. An effective mechanized assault in modern warfare requires overwhelming fire support, detailed drone reconnaissance, effective electronic warfare suppression, and close coordination between armor and specialized infantry. The Russian High Command is failing at every single step. Commanders are launching multi-vehicle columns with inadequate, outdated reconnaissance, sending them into zones that are known to be saturated with Ukrainian FPV drones and anti-tank teams. The most notorious example of this tactical ineptitude is the continued reliance on generals whose careers are defined by previous spectacular failures. The command is being entrusted to individuals who have proven their penchant for suicidal, frontal mechanized assaults, a doctrine that has already cost thousands of lives in past battles. This is not a military decision, it is a political failure. The officers who rise to the top of the Putin vertical are rewarded for political loyalty and audacious reports, not for tactical competence or prudence. The consequence is that they are willing to burn through their last armored reserves and sacrifice the infantry for the sake of a positive report sent to the Kremlin. The ultimate tragedy is the human cost of this incompetence. The High Command's failure to provide adequate drone and artillery support means that the infantry riding on the tops of these tanks is being sent to certain destruction. The soldiers are sacrificed to sustain a tactical fantasy. When the unescorted columns are quickly immobilized by FPV strikes targeting the tracks and engines, the infantry is forced to dismount into the open, a kill zone already zeroed in by Ukrainian artillery. The High Command is effectively using its soldiers as expendable cannon fodder to buy a few meters of ground or to satisfy the political demands for a visible offensive. This tactical mismanagement, which places the burden of the war on the lives of the soldiers, is the clearest indicator that the Russian army is caught in a self-destructive cycle. We have meticulously analyzed the systemic failure of the Russian military, the catastrophic quality of its equipment, the political incompetence of its command, and the suicidal tactical choices on the front line. The final, unavoidable verdict on the conflict is clear. The ultimate military advantage belongs entirely to Ukraine's strategy of adaptation and technological agility, a factor that guarantees the current positional deadlock will inevitably lead to Russia's defeat. The core realization of this phase of the war is that Russia is trapped in a strategy of self-consumption. The nation possesses a quantitative advantage in resources and personnel, yet it is structurally incapable of utilizing that advantage effectively. The High Command is committing its precious, finite armored reserves, the tanks and IFVs hoarded for a final, decisive maneuver, to assaults that are tactically flawed and politically motivated. These vehicles are being consumed by the Ukrainian defense, not because of overwhelming numerical superiority, but because of a devastating technological asymmetry, the accurate low-cost lethality of the FPV drone, and the effective placement of anti-tank defenses. This decision to burn through final reserves on doomed attacks confirms that the Russian war effort is being driven by a political demand for progress rather than a rational military plan. In stark contrast, the Ukrainian armed forces are demonstrating a military maturity that guarantees the strategic initiative remains with Kiev. Ukraine's advantage is not measured in the size of its tank fleet, but in the speed of its technological evolution. The Ukrainian command has mastered the art of low-cost, high-impact defense. They have engineered a new defensive doctrine, the integration of drone surveillance, swift mobile counterattack forces, and the clever use of armor as localized defense assets, which has systematically neutralized Russia's brute force methods. The stability of the front is a direct outcome of this superior strategy. While Russia is busy refurbishing its obsolete T-62 tanks and sacrificing infantry to uphold a political lie, Ukraine is scaling up its inherent advantages, mass-producing advanced drones and establishing resilient, multi-echelon defenses. This contrast ensures that the strategic stalemate is not merely a pause in the fighting, it is the active mechanism accelerating Russia's structural collapse. Every failed mechanized assault confirms to the Kremlin that its existing military machine is obsolete. The continuous loss of equipment on the front, coupled with the political paralysis preventing the total mobilization of the economy, guarantees that the conflict will become financially and militarily unsustainable. The war will conclude not through a final Russian victory, but through the point of critical mass where the Kremlin is forced to acknowledge that its resources are exhausted, its military doctrine is bankrupt, and the only remaining option is to accept a ceasefire dictated by the reality of its own unsurmountable failure.